Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of Kiss Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of organic growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. Our first guest in 2019 is Jeremy Plumb. Jeremy is the Director of Production Science at Pruf Cultivar, one of the most technologically advanced cannabis cultivation facilities in all of North America. At Pruf, Jeremy combines decades of cannabis horticulture experience with cutting-edge technology to deliver previously unattainable consistency in both product quality and consumer effect. Prior to his leadership at Pruf, Jeremy was a co-founder of Pharma, recently acclaimed by Rolling Stone as one of Oregon's top dispensaries. Jeremy has served as a cannabis consultant to Israel medical cannabis researchers as a cannabis policy advisor for U.S. members of Congress. He also serves on the OLCC's Rulemaking Advisory Committee. In 2015, Jeremy co-founded Cultivation Classic, Oregon's leading craft cannabis competition. He serves on the technical advisory board of the Resource Innovation Institute and is the co-founder of the Open Cannabis Project. He lives in Portland, Oregon with his border collie Lucy, and when he can, finds few greater joys than sailing on the mighty Columbia River. I caught back up with Jeremy this week and got to ask him many of your questions as well as a few of my own. Here's the interview. All right. Hey, Jeremy, thanks for coming back on the show. I really appreciate it.
Hey, it's a pleasure, Tad. Really excited to be back with you.
All right. Well, let's just dive right in with questions because I've gotten a bunch over the past week and a half, and I had a few of my own. I'm just going to go ahead and take the ones from guests first. This one was left on the YouTube channel from AK Frost, and he said, I'm curious about the different red spectrum's effects on the plant's production, quality, and cannabinoids. Also, what were his findings as far as best target PPFDs for different stages of the plant's life or age?
Okay, actually, if you could repeat the second question, I actually didn't hear that clearly. I got the first part.
So if you want to address the first one, he's asking about
Good.
Red spectrum effects on plant production, quality, and cannabinoid production.
So in terms of morphology or production quality, we know that red light has this effect on plants that is either shade avoidant or shade tolerant in terms of how the plant responds. Cannabis has this remarkable evolutionary heritage of clearly being shade avoidant, which if you read if you read Rob Clark's Evolution and Ethnobotany treatise that he wrote with George Merlin, one of the early sort of theories he had is that when hunter-gatherers were bringing seeds back to where human settlements were, and the seeds were sort of both being consumed and also cast by the area where they were inhabiting, these plants, while they're growing under a forest canopy, sopping up most of the near red light, were quite responsive to the far red light still passing through the canopy, thus creating these really long plants reaching up to capture the light again. So really you see this shade avoidant behavior, but that has some unfavorable implications for production. And the last one I talked about some of the favorable outcomes. The unfavorable outcome is, in general, we're trying to reduce lanky cultivars and create more compact, consistent growth. So there's some balance there if you're seeing some elongated internodal spacing, but that's the first part. Oh, in terms of phytochemistry, we're seeing nominal effects that actually have not been fully quantified, even though we're about a year deep into this. Only this last 3-month round is really mature enough to be able to clearly tell that story. And so I actually can't say with any kind of definitive answer what the difference is yet, but there is a difference for sure. In a future podcast, I could definitely speak to that.
Okay, and then he was asking what your findings were as far as best target PPFD levels for different stages of plant growth.
So this is a complicated theme that I'll try to be succinct in responding to, which is that the PPFD targets for different developmental stages varies greatly, both by cultivar and which sort of region you're bringing those cultivars from. Clearly, high light regions affect the evolution of the plant to be receptive to heightened PPFD targets. And one example, just at the most simple level, is that a narrow blade morphology clearly had something like an abundance of solar radiation. a broad blade morphology was probably trying to more efficiently capture that solar radiation. And so that kind of can tell you in a spectrum between narrow and broad leaf if the plant was likely to be able to receive higher or lower amounts of light in an optimal sort of setting. But in terms of PPFD targets that we use, I was at the PhotoX conference with you recently, and I met a man from Grupo Flor who's running really mega high intense targets in early veg. Clearly, if you get high light in early veg and the plants can tolerate it without causing harm, you find that you actually get to this super metabolic plant that is got incredibly thick stalk and is going to have more biomass creation, more phytochemical yield. I've not found that plants can tolerate near to the levels that he was describing, but without going too far down the wormhole, something like, in propagation with dimmable LEDs, one of the huge advantages is that you can graduate the light from a very low amount in that first couple of days while rooting is not begun and you're really adjusting to this kind of new environment, and then graduate maybe around 150 to 250 U-moles. Production goes into a vegetative environment in the vicinity of 400 U-moles. In blooming environments, we're seeing with people that are running double-ended HPS somewhere near 800 to 900 U-moles. One example of like our LED implementation is that we're getting closer to 1400 U-moles. But the gradations and the different sort of developmental stages for different cultivars vary widely, and it's really important to not try to approach a one-size-fits-all solution and to really find what your plants and your particular environment, where the best plant health is.
I just want to add to this and correct me if I say anything wrong here. I remember at PhotoX, there was some research presented, some of it, I believe, from Dr. Allison Justice, who's coming on the podcast soon. I'm very excited. She did some research looking at different target PPFD levels from an efficiency perspective in terms of yield and the cost of that lighting from, I believe she was using wattage, over time at 800, 1,000, and then 1,200. And in that facility using the cultivars, they found that 1,000 was that sort of sweet spot for yield and light efficiency. But there was another one presented where they went up to, I believe, 1,500, looking at 1,500 U-moles, looking at it, and found that cannabis could tolerate, this particular cultivar could tolerate those high light levels. They hadn't found that upward limit. But again, at that point, I think the issue is more light efficiency in terms of what your yield is sort of on a bell curve, as it was explained to me. And so at some point we're maximizing our yield. If we go beyond that point, we may get a little bit more yield, but the amount of light that we're going to use to do that makes it less and less efficient. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. And really, this becomes a consideration for especially commercial cannabis producers. Operation expenses must be reduced to lower the overall cost and inputs to create a margin and so forth. But there's actually a paper along these same lines that I haven't read in a few years. That was the only paper I ever saw published, I believe from University of Mississippi, that had essentially an efficiency study where light intensity, CO2 level, and temperature were correlated, and they showed some sort of gradations that illustrated if you were going beyond around 1,000 U-mole, you were seeing like very nominal gains in biomass creation. There wasn't phytochemical data correlated with that study. So that study had a variety of issues and was kind of the first of its kind. But I would say that Allison's work is more contemporary, and they're really working with more contemporary production technology and better cannabis chemovars, and so some more interesting insight there. But one thing I'll say is that production variables, for operational efficiency aren't necessarily the most important targets for all of us, especially if you're seeking to produce, really monumental chemotypes and really diverse ones. It turns out like really cannabis can tolerate a lot of light. I think that one of the things my friend Bob Hoffman, who's a frequent participant of PhotoX, says is that we've actually made a lot of CO2 junkie plants and that we use probably more CO2 than is needed. And there's actually a negative side effect where you actually have a reduced amount of stomatal development. So the stomates are getting this message in the morphological development that they're essentially not needed in such an abundance. And so you create plants that really need to have these very, very high CO2 environments. Of course, when we're looking at light intensity, you have to speak to the relationship between light and gas. And there are gas exchange equipment that can be used, made by Lycor and other technology companies that are certainly used in high throughput phenotyping that help you to correlate what is the correct amount of light and CO2 for this particular plant. I know in the future, most production facilities will have used those tools to figure out very specific responses. But yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, and one thing you touched on that I just want to highlight is you mentioned that with dimmable lights, with LEDs, you can sort of progress the plant slowly to these target PPFD levels. Everything I've heard about LEDs, and I've never grown under LEDs, I've only grown under HPS technology. You really have to work the plant up. You have to be very careful to slowly raise the plant to the higher light intensity. You can't just flip a switch.
That's one of the both strengths and weaknesses. It's that if people do not adopt sophisticated strategies to incrementally graduate these curves in the production environment, which of course we can never just look at one element in the production environment like lighting on its own and really get a good outcome. All of the variables move together and in interesting ways, and correlating VPD with your light intensity and stages of development for diverse chemovars is a lot of the art for those of us who are working to produce novel chemovars.
All right, great answer. So this, I assume it's a gentleman. I don't know why I assume AK Frost means it's male, but this person also asked, what caused your major crashes in living soils? You had mentioned in the last episode that you had tried a bunch of living soils, but had a lot of issues.
Yes. So as I mentioned, I had some of the best outcomes I've ever had. It was pathogens. It was over time, whether there was rice root aphid infestation that developed even after pretty thorough entry-exit protocols, and ultimately having lots of organic media and numerous vectors. Of course, humans and plants are generally the worst, but media behind that somewhere. Or the russet mice and broad mites. At some point, I found at least a population of each of those three pathogens, and using all of the biocontrols that I was employing, which in a small garden, we're talking like a 16-light garden, spending around $3,000 for a single crop cycle in biological pest controls that were ineffective in regulating those populations. It just resulted in this kind of situation that I felt the media, which I had huge root zones, they were 1 cubic yard custom designed smart pots that, 4 foot by 4 foot by 4 foot, working with sort of deep rhizosphere dynamics and shared root zones. It just felt that if you had an entrenched population, you could at best sort of manage that population, and many successful growers continue to cultivate with root aphids and other nasty pathogens that are creating an erratic production environment, but you can still, with a lot of intense IPM management and focus, still get great outcomes. But the reality is they were just so varied, but prior to the presence of those pathogens, I was just getting such amazing quality of flowers. But the bottom line is, I think as long as you were very stringent, like my friend David T. God in Canada, if you haven't heard of him, is a brilliant grower. Oh, of course, I think, Tad, he's been on this podcast.
Yeah, he's a good friend of mine. He's been on the podcast.
Yeah, so David, of course, is doing living soil at scale, and has some great protocols for how to manage the issues that he's endured. But at the end of it, I know I'm trying to do something that's closer to precision ag. It just was about what your outcomes are. Like, there's so many good ways to proceed in cultivating cannabis, but I know I really had to adhere to something that was a reproducible media and a very consistent baseline, so that I could get to this high resolution insight with the chemovars.
Yeah, I think for a cultivation facility that's not so focused on science or on exact replication, like you're really trying to pull a lot of research and data out of your facility, which is amazing. And I think living soils does just introduce too much variability for what you're trying to do. So that makes perfect sense.
On the other hand, we all may die and bring every other species with us if we do not mass adopt living soil strategies as part of a mosaic to adapt more effectively to changing times. So I'm, again, never want to dissuade anybody through some fearful message that pathogens are uncontainable or the erraticness of living soil is not tenable, because I guarantee there's just all sorts of incredible cannabis being grown in living soil pretty consistently at this point in the market. And I think it's a real differentiating factor for commercial producers. I really cherish samples that are shared with me that are produced in that model. I just feel like I need to say that.
Yeah, something that Jaya Palmer, a good friend of mine, and Suzanne Wainwright Evans really emphasize is that we're not able to, and we're not trying to eradicate these insect populations. We're just trying to manage them below an economic threshold. So a lot of the facilities we work with are dealing with these problems. At some point in time, they got introduced into the facility. I think it's inevitable, more or less. But if we can manage them effectively, then it's going to be okay, you know?
And not to gloat, I will say, after having endured hell, where I've, of course, gathered genetics from around the planet and had a variety of medical gardens, and I've seen every imaginable pathogen, I feel, at this point. I mean, certainly there are nastier viruses out there somewhere and things that we have yet to see, not to be overconfident, but I've endured hell. That said, it is remarkable to be in a commercially focused facility with 16 environments and a team of up to 40 people coming and going, and to go for nearly an entire year with not a single pathogen, and I'm talking not a fungus gnat, in an organic crop production based facility. I'm proud of that, and that took a lot of design and creativity and passion amongst the team to be able to execute, but that is a good feeling on the other hand.
Oh, that's pretty amazing. I mean, to be able to control your inputs so tightly into those spaces is quite incredible. Well, let me, just to keep things moving along, I've got some more questions here. This one comes to you from Lana Patrick. I think it's pronounced Lana. She said she has the opportunity to oversee a project in the more equatorial region of our planet next year. She's concerned because the temperatures are consistently around 80 degrees and the lowest humidity levels are about 65%. Already, the draw on energy is going to be focused on dehumidification, and I want to try and eliminate as much AC draw as possible. Having worked as a cultivator in a large-scale facility in Northern California, I have extensive experience with double-ended bulbs, but I don't have any knowledge of the newer LED products that are available. Jeremy briefly mentioned his success using LEDs. What I'm hoping for is some guidance on the different spectrums and how they affect veg and flower and which particular brand has worked for him.
Wonderful. Well, I've had a particular trajectory where I think I mentioned in the last episode that I've tried a wide array of LEDs in the early days, and like most, we're left disappointed. Beyond the fact that using some deep violet and ultraviolet lights in LEDs clearly produced more compact morphology, the intensity was lacking for creating a sort of generative canopy or bloom canopy. But I will say that where LEDs have come to now is, just night and day. There's incredible output, there's great efficiency, there's great spectrums. There are different spectrums for different things. I think people are really at the beginning of being able to answer which chemovars are responding to which spectra, at which stages of development and which intensities. And that, again, is a lot of the art right now. But I've had the blessing of working with Fluence Bioengineering most closely. It's been a more than 4-year relationship. Before they were Fluence, they were BML. And I've really followed actually the CEO, Nick Clays, who has now stepped down as they have been acquired by Osram and are actually scaling all of the tech that they've built now into an international presence with even greater service capabilities. But I really feel that Fluence has authored a pretty unique product. There are other great companies in the LED space. Just to say another name that I care about, Neil Iorio, who is actually a past NASA scientist who founded BIOS Lighting and also has good products. But like I said, my main experience has been working with Fluence Tech. And I will say that the PhysioSpec spectrum that they bring, which is based on the ceramic metal halide, has been very successful, sort of closer to a one-size-fits-all spectral solution that you can use at every stage of development. And the great results are happening there. And there's a really sweet spot about efficiency, wavelength, and intensity that they've achieved. Further, I think the build quality is great. The service the company has provided is great. But there are certainly other companies. What I would say is that people who are looking into the new lighting tech will hear a lot of things about other lighting technologies that are potentially, superior to LED. And I won't validate that I've seen any version of like a plasma light or another lighting source that is as efficient or effective as LED. I personally, after reviewing as much of the lighting technology as I can and have been able over the last, especially 5 years, I feel that LEDs are the future of hort. They're getting more efficient, although we've departed from Moore's law. The semiconductors are not having the same kind of big gains they were over the last many years. The new generation of Fluence Tech that just came out is more efficient, higher intensity, better formidable build strength than anything before. And I think we're just at a place where, especially if you can find energy rebates in your local region that offset the cost of the lights, you find that they're very cost effective. And even if you don't get those rebates and you have bigger CapEx expenditure, if you run ROI calculations on the reduced OpEx of LEDs versus other solutions, it's just mind-blowing. I mean, companies that don't wire with LEDs that have now invested all this money into double-ended HPS and so forth, I believe just by OpEx alone will be spending so much more to create the same product at arguably a lower quality than companies that have wired with broad spectrum LEDs, that it's going to be like a difference maker for whether a company is viable or not, because the cost of replacing lighting, which is designed in concert with your HVAC for controlled environment production, is just immense. And so in any case, starting with a call to Fluence would be my personal recommendation, but they're not paying me. I don't get kickbacks. I just have been well served and learned to use their tech in a way that gets results that surpass anything that I've been able to achieve through other means.
Yeah, I joke sometimes that this is turning into a Fluence podcast because most of the growers that I've had on the show are working with Fluence in terms of the lighting solutions that they prefer. Now, I know Nelson Lindsley with Poetry of Plants has done some trials using some other lights, and there is some technology coming into that industry space, which is great because I think competition only breeds better products for growers. But Fluence does a great job. I love that company. I love a lot of their employees. They're just good people. And I've been fortunate to be able to attend Photo X and things like that where I got to meet you. So I have a lot of respect for the company as well. But people do need to do their research, and it's such a challenge wading through all of the different marketing claims out there on the market. Every LED company seems to have their own angle, and it's really hard to know what to believe. So you really got to do your due diligence.
It is, and I don't want to pretend to have the one right way, because one of the things about our craft is that there are just so many ways to approach the challenges we're all confronted with as producers. And yet I will say that I've just never had an experience with another company that sort of I would put to the same level of quality of service, quality of content, and sort of product innovation leaders as I've had with Fluence. And so it's hard to not be passionate, but it's hilarious when you mention that so many other people on the podcast have also raved about it. I do know there's other companies that are making an effort, but as you've mentioned, they all use marketing language to support their sort of lighting solution. And what we really need is independent evaluation of these attributes. How efficient is it? How intense can it be? How effective is it in using different wavelengths? And, really look at these sort of in a more objective fashion. But I think actually those were the things I looked at to evaluate Fluence versus other fixtures, and found that it was a clear sort of dominating force currently. But I'm excited. There's new tech on the horizon constantly. One thing that my friend Dan Gustafic from Hybrid Tech has talked about frequently is that having water-cooled LEDs will help the efficiency and for vertical farming applications be an exciting thing. I personally have looked at these kind of fixtures and see moving parts and flowing water with electric work and plumbing challenges and a variety of other issues that don't, so far, at least from my perspective, justify the efficiency gains. But clearly there are all sorts of imaginative things that will come up as the industry is going to scale. Anyways, I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to change directions entirely with this next question. This is from Blue Dot Organics on Instagram. He wanted to know, when collecting pollen from a male cannabis plant that has been selected for desired traits, hoping to be passed on to its progeny, is there a specific period in its flowering cycle that would, statistically speaking, give the best chance for passing on the desired trait? So, for example,
to make sure I'm understanding this. Oh, yeah.
Oh, so he said, for example, using pollen that dropped 4 weeks into flowering compared to 6 or 7 weeks.
I would certainly say if you're introducing male pollen earlier and then ongoing is better than later. I'd say 4 weeks is, I think, a pretty general consensus for where people are applying it, because you have an inflorescence that has made a pistillate mass that's broader than 1 centimeter that now can start to receive the pollen, and that you want to give maximal opportunity for that. Of course, I think a lot of us are actually moving away from using male pollen and finding advantage in using dionysious breeding that actually is more using a solution of maybe silver thiosulfate or colloidal silver to induce sort of monoecious tendencies in a female plant to increase the likelihood of sort of genetic stability of the particular expression of a trait sooner than later, and not kind of have the XY chromosome come into the equation at all. But in any case, around 4 weeks is a pretty, I think that's pretty generally what people do, and that's around what I've done in the past.
So you're referring to the process known in the industry as feminized seeds or feminizing seeds?
Correct. Yes. Okay. But using that not just for the production of seeds that produce low or no males, but actually to also use that as a tool for breeding in a targeted way to more efficiently get towards genetic stability of a particular trait.
Okay, I'm going to ask one of my questions now. So have you seen any level of chemotypic expression or chemovar correlation with pest pressure or pathogens in terms of a plant's ability to resist these intrusions?
Absolutely. You know, one of the interesting things when you think about the evolutionary origins of secondary metabolites, and actually only in the last year did we learn from that team of scientists in Canada, I believe, that we're able to figure out that a viral attack had occurred millions of years ago that created this miraculous biosynthase in cannabis that results in the production of cannabinoids and goes beyond terpenoids. But the terpenoids are largely considered to be a part of pest defense response, and clearly pest pressure and pathogen pressure or any kind of stress has a relationship to the sort of expression of a chemovar. And so there are all kinds of different ways you can explore intentional stress to enhance the chemovar profile. And even I've heard of very obscure things like root pruning to induce stress, certainly using mixed sort of photoperiod rhythms, being able to induce stress through a broad array of potential strategies is what I think is kind of the palette we can work with to explore the range a single genotype can produce of chemistry. But that's the important sense, is that I think in the old world, and most of the world still sees cannabis this way, is sort of, if you have this plant, it makes this chemistry, and you have breeders who are kind of promising that, and seed providers who say, well, these seeds are having this ratio of CBD and terpenes, and it's like, well, when did you harvest it? Harvest timing is a huge variable in what kind of chemistry you're seeing or what level of chemo intensity. What region and terroir and all of the other influences that are contributing will have a huge amount to do with what is evoked. But back to pathogen pressure, I will say that I believe some of the really high results I've seen in terpene oils in the past pathogens were expressed in the garden, like rice root aphids, actually. I saw, not consistently, but erratically, a result that was shocking. Like suddenly, the near 3% oil producing plant, which is already a high oil, pretty monumental expression, went to nearly a 5%, for a single result. And could I reproduce that? Hell no. But was it exciting to find and to sort of muse about the relationship between the stress of the pathogen pressure and the chemistry? Definitely. I think there's a lot more work to do around that. And even back to an earlier question you asked, is it ideal to have no pathogens? Well, if your goal is totally consistent phytochemical outcomes, yes, but there is a case to be made, again, for this maximal biology, sort of soil food web, everything coexisting, and that actually that could be an advantage in some situations for particular chemovar creation.
Yeah, we know that as a plant is naturally senescing or completing its life cycle, plant stress can have a huge impact as it pushes more energy into, like you mentioned, trichome production and these expressions of various chemicals. 99% of the industry right now is still stressing their plants out in ways that we don't fully understand and looking to reduce plant stress. But I would love to see some research down the road of targeted plant stress, as if we do create this certain type of stress on the plant at this particular stage of its life cycle, we are going to see an increase in this particular, this particular terpene or this particular cannabinoid. I think we'll get there. But plant stress is a fascinating topic. I totally agree.
Agreed. And one other important thing I think that we should say is for all of the craft growers and producers who might hear this, that I know one of the most important things that occurred for me in the past was when I had this run-in with a director of research in a genomic company who essentially was very, very meticulous at what she did from a sort of plant science background, and came and looked at some of the observational studies I was conducting to try to elicit these kind of relationships. And she was very critical of my process because of, in her experience, using plant growth chambers with incredibly exacting conditions with a single factor that is changing, creates really useful data. But in our line, I think most cannabis growers are still looking at very complicated environments and making correlations that are actually indefensible, that are very likely incorrect, and that these sort of assumptions and gut feelings and loose correlations are not the stuff of, say, for example, studying a specific pathogen pressure on the relationship to a chemovar. There has to be so much work put in on the front side. This is actually what I feel over the last almost 2 years at Pruf I've been working on, is just getting to a baseline that we can reproduce and then control for the ability to see the impact of a single variable change. And that is hard, and it's exhausting, and it's not rewarding, and it doesn't make a bunch of revenue or anything, but it does give you the possibility of truly starting to correlate things in a meaningful way. So I guess I want to make a call for, we all have to work with a higher level of rigor than we have in the past to really know what we know. And there's a lot of mystic farmers and sort of, like people who have a lot of experience with the plant. And I've had a lot of experience with the plant too, but that I've learned that some of the things I took as sort of the truths that I'd experienced in the past, I have now disproven through better quality research and through experimental design that refutes conclusions that I had made in the past. So I think a producer could never spend enough time on this idea of how do you optimize experimental design so that you can start to get high quality insight. Because if you really care about this thing, to know one thing really clearly rather than many things in a kind of fuzzy way, I would argue is probably more valuable at this point.
Well, I think that's great because you point out that's really what the mind of a scientist is. You're not trying, you have a hypothesis, but you're not trying to lead the data or the research in any real direction. You kind of have to go with where it takes you. And I think the big takeaway from what you're saying is that maybe as cultivators and consultants and people in the industry that work with this plant, we should be a little less confident with the claims that we're making based on our observations, because all of our observations are in a sense tainted, because there is so much variability out there in all of these environments.
Tad, you have said what I was trying to say far more directly. That is it. I think there's a heaping portion of humility about what we know. And I think a lot of that, I want to just appreciate it, and I certainly experience it. If there's insecurity, if you're concerned about your future position in this space that's rapidly evolving and you're seeing like proliferation of scientists and stuff, it doesn't surprise me that there's a temptation to overcompensate. But I just think it's important, because we all care about serving this plant, that there's a measure of self-reflection about why we might compensate. On one hand, yes, there are really people who are called to carry forth this plant and ensure that it is available for future generations and the highest level of use and so forth. But there's also a need to be humble in the face of what is such an unbelievably daunting and vast task as like actually understanding these relationships between chemistry and plants and humans and their interactions with the environment. And I mean, this is big stuff, and it is a humble task. And of course, like in science as well, any result is a good result. It's just very often you don't get a result that supports your thesis, and more often than not, by far. And so, yes, being open to that.
Yeah, and I don't think that discourages artistry in the cannabis industry on the cultivation side. There are some people that do just have a knack for this plant and growing this plant, and maybe we can't right now, science can't prove all of the ideas and principles that they're using or pushing forward or what's working for them. But that might be because science hasn't caught up with them too. So I don't want people to be discouraged just because they don't have a research scientist background. I think we can utilize these tools as we grow as an industry, but I don't think that means that the artistry is going away by any means. There's just too much room to grow still.
Well said. I will say the frustration that I've had in having some media sort of exposure in the last, especially few years, was I get painted as this person who only cares about science, and science is everything. And I so agree with what you just said, that in fact, I identify as an artist. I actually identify as a musician. I see chemistry as correlated with literally musical frequencies, and using mix engineering model of like lows, low mids, mid highs, and highs for what you would do in audio mixing. I use that to produce chemotypes in my garden. I feel that I'm playing, this sort of facility as an instrument, and that there's these compositions that emerge. And if I wasn't sustained by that deeper creative narrative, there is no way I could persevere through the detailed tasks that science demands in order to gain clear insight. But if anything, I'm more artist than science, and I think most of us are. But I also cherish the insights of science and the opportunities for us to serve people and this planet in ways that we've never been able to go much farther. But yes, do not want to dissuade anybody from their creative process. There will be a lot of things we'll never be able to explain that people can achieve through a miraculous relationship with the plant. It is a relationship at the end of the day, always.
Yeah, and you mentioned something a minute ago that I thought was really, really interesting when you were talking about how it's better to know one thing really, really well than a broad general thing without a very good idea of it. And that's interesting to me because at this Soil Scientist Society meeting I just got back from, which was awesome, by the way, the fact that they would even had an interest in cannabis and were willing to have people come and speak about cannabis. And my goal was really just to encourage them to work in cannabis and see all the gaps that we have in science. But I was sitting next to this young woman. She was a graduate student at MIT, actually, incredibly brilliant. All of these soil scientists were. And I was asking her about her research, and she was studying the effects of iron oxide on methane production in soils, and not looking at anything to do with cattle or cow production or anything like that. Literally just the small amount of methane that's produced naturally in soils. Just this minuscule, tiny bit of research that she knew really, really well. And that's one of the reasons I think science takes so long, is because we have this. Oh, I lost you, Jeremy. Let me call you right back. All right, Jeremy, good to have you back. I have a new question for you here. We'll just start from scratch since I lost you. This one comes from my buddy Nelson Lindsley with Poetry of Plants. He's been on the podcast a few times. He asks, with all the work being performed by Jeremy and his associates, how can one safeguard the genetic IP, intellectual property, from becoming subject to the same big pharma paradigm they're looking to reinvent? And then he goes on. Let me just finish reading this so you can get the whole thing, but it is a pretty tough question. So he says, personally, I struggle with bringing superior medical cultivars into the public domain without there being a clear roadmap to its availability and fair access to those who are in need, as well as incentive for its caretaker and creator. Second to that, there are only a few companies like Phylos who are creating a database or catalog of this information, and with the odd speculative investment climate in today's market, it is unsettling to give the keys to any castle that can be purchased and kept at bay from all of the intentions expressed on this latest podcast. And then he says, on further note, it is always a pleasure to listen to the very articulate Jeremy Plumb, who is one of the few individuals I have ever met that embodies the spirit of the garden in all of his actions and is somehow able to speak for an hour straight with only a half dozen ums or ers. I am convinced you are from a future planet and a better one at that.
Aw. Well, of course, I have to start with, Nelson Lindsley is a unique and unbelievably creative force in this space. And I've had the honor and privilege to get to work with him to some limited extent, partly through the Fluence community, and just so respect his work. And I'm grateful for the question. I started to think he was throwing me a softball because he's aware that I was a co-founder of the Open Cannabis Project, but then the question got a little thicker. So I respect this form. A tiny bit about the genetic heritage piece. This is a podcast unto itself, really, but I do need to say a few words, which is that there is a lot at risk. And if people have not woken up to the sort of terrifying reality that in advance of federal regulation occurring, the U.S. Patent and Trade Office has granted a number of patents that patent experts would consider to be weak claims and very unlikely to be able to actually be defended. But the fact that they've granted these plants without an ability to survey all of the prior art or the plants that have existed in the public domain, therefore not being able to differentiate what is novel, what is actually new and the outcome of some kind of intensive, unique breeding program, and what was just in the chemoscape, what has been out there circulating with people who have risked their lives, in many cases lost their lives, in many cases done jail time in order to persevere to make sure that this plant is available for not just our generation, but future generations, and that especially the useful and uniquely therapeutically active plants aren't taken offline in just a giant land grab that then disallows this sort of folk medicine application, that this is a core theme for anybody who's involved in this space. And I think, it started to become a topic that I was passionate about years ago. And in part, Dr. Mowgli Holmes, a founder of Phylos, really, and CEO, was also incredibly concerned with this and actually started all of the initial momentum. And then I recognized that after I saw the initial patents being accepted, that even though I didn't have time to do this work and like everybody else was really busy, that I had to allocate focus toward ensuring that we have a response in defense of the plant and in defense of all the people who should be able to work with the plant. So the Open Cannabis Project, I am no longer on the board for. I stepped down in December. It has an amazing executive director named Beth Schechter and this world-class board, including people from technology and legal space who are eminently qualified to address these issues. I would heavily, and I would advise everybody who cares to actually support that effort, both in money and time, and to chime in with Beth and find out how to support that effort, because this is a historic moment where there is a juncture that is like never been afforded another industry. We have the opportunity to protect all of that prior art and to ensure those things are made available for future generations and not just see it kind of disappear in the land grab. And that's a really big deal, but it takes a lot of resources. The approach they've taken is to create the world's largest database of chemotypic and also genetic data to be able to help define the prior art and then to relate with USPTO and others as an advocacy group. There's many other initiatives, but it's just exciting to see where they've gone. After being the executive director for a couple years, helping get it off the ground, I just simply couldn't continue to be involved in so many efforts, and I really have to focus on my work here at Pruf. So that's what is going on in terms of the genetic space that I think is most important. There are other teams like Strainly in Canada that are working in a similar way for open source plant, Creative Commons style intellectual property protections, and that's another important effort. But in any case, I'm biased and believe you should check out Open Cannabis Project. Back to his notion about the plants, that are special, you have to be very careful with how they come forward because they could quickly get hoovered up into some ecosystem that does not have, the public benefit and interest of the whole in mind and in heart, and that really does matter. So I work very hard to find relationships with people that have demonstrated ethics and the complexity of the cannabis industry, which, there's no sort of like just black and white for me in this space. There's a hugely challenging frontier that we're all operating in, and working to build relationships that matter and that are forged based on shared ethics is really an important part of the work that I do. And I try my damnedest to uphold that. I tell you, like everybody, we're all occasionally put into a position that's uncomfortable around having to navigate our own needs, the needs of the company we're serving potentially, and the needs of a growing market, and the needs of a future generation that is yet to arrive that we want to see get more benefit than ours did from this amazing plant. So I don't have any magic formulas or recipes or pretend to have some high ground as much as it is a sincere effort that has been lifelong for me, and having always been in a kind of activist position in this space as well as in a creative and scientific discovery position, I feel an obligation to try to bring what eldership I can to the younger people that are now having opportunities to make big impact in intellectual property and so forth. But I will say we need to get therapeutic plants out now that are not just type 1, high THC, myrcene dominant, sort of core user profiles. And that is a big part of the mission that we're doing at Pruf, is to really resource a huge amount of plants that look like what my friend Mojave called in Big Sur, the early moderate THC, high terpenoline profiles that actually were a very important part of the whole community who was at the ground zero of cannabis coming through the U.S. That really went away when we got into this high THC type 1 myrcene stuff that, is great for what it does. It's just one note, and there's this entire spectrum that we can be addressing. So I think it's very important to now partner with clinical research to be able to differentiate these new profiles in terms of the incredible therapeutic actions they can provide and the quality of life boon they offer, and that is a central mission. So withholding special plants from the market only to try to protect them when they haven't even been substantiated has other issues, but finding ways to bring them forward with agreements that feel like they're able to protect the best interests of both the humanity and the more than human world, as well as companies' prerogative to make profit and try to survive an unbelievably challenging startup industry as a startup company. That's challenging stuff. And I know I have a lot to learn, and I'm constantly striving to find other people who can help to shine light on that forward path. And I've strived to do that for others. I think I'm missing some other part of his question. I don't know if you feel that I've adequately spoken to that.
No, I enjoyed what you said, and I would agree that I think I met Beth briefly at Emerald Cup. She's a wonderful human being. I had a great time chatting with her, and I'm hoping to get her and also the people over at Candor over on the podcast. I have them scheduled with them as well. They're doing something really interesting from the herbarium perspective. But I guess the question I would ask you based on this is in your own experience then. So with Pruf and with Phylos, what happens when you do get that special plant? Because you are beholden to investors. You are a for-profit business. Yet I know you have this passion about preserving and sharing these genetics. How do you balance that between profitability and sort of your own values in terms of how this plant should be shared?
Well, one thing I'll say is that it was a miracle that I found the team that I did, that I found a team that was willing to entertain the notion that we could do a lot to transform the space that we're in, and was willing to take risks and to go up the steep hill and to pursue challenging terrain, and that didn't want just the lowest hanging fruit, which is all the immediate near-term revenue targets, and that wasn't an easy thing. I don't believe there are a ton of teams that are like that in the world right now. It's very challenging when you're living hand to mouth to ambition to make a difference in kind of the larger trajectory of the plant. And to do that at scale is, it has been quite an intense experience to try to be responsible for the various needs, and to both have a profitable endeavor that can survive and exist in the world and be supported, and through doing meaningful service and providing a product mix and sort of perspectives that really help people and help this whole thing to go forward, and to keep my eye on, the core values that I have always lived with in this space, and that I feel the plant itself is arguably the best teacher of. And one of the things I'll say personally about how the plant helps me to navigate this is that there's a reflective quality in those first moments of a euphoric state where some kind of useful chemistry has been ingested, and then there's quiet and there's an opportunity to evaluate the things that have happened. Maybe it's I wronged somebody in a relationship. It was a subtle thing, and in the moment I was going 60 miles an hour and I did not observe the way in which that had impact on another person. And then I have an opportunity to pick that up, to kind of keep relatively clear in the relationships that I'm in by virtue of using the chemistry the plant provides. And that I think that is easily one of the most useful tools, because reflective time is something that's rare in our very busy lives, that actually affords us the ability to live more wholly, to be responsible for the expressions that we're involved with, still continuing to persevere with ethics and style and creativity, and to not just be purely self-interested or ever in a position of harming others intentionally, and to then pick up if unintentional harm has occurred, the responsibility in the best way that we can. I think without the plant, I would never be able to sustain the pressure cooker that is this kind of modern cannabis industry unfurling. And that's really the core guide.
So it sounds like there really isn't a clear path at this point, even within, or for you and your company, in terms of exactly what will happen when that special plant does come along. Am I missing this? I mean, I'm hearing all of your passion and love for cannabis, and I know you to be a very ethical person, and I love everything you're doing. I'm just wondering, is there like a concrete way for people to preserve that in your eyes, or have you established one for Proof, where when that holy grail of a plant comes along that could transform medicine or do whatever, what's your roadmap to balance that? Or maybe it doesn't exist yet, is what I'm hearing possibly.
Well, that's part of it. It's that I don't believe actually there's going to be a plant that's the plant, because we know that there's such a broad range of genetic diversity as a result of how extensively the plant has been outbred, especially on the West Coast, and just how many different things it can do for how many different kinds of people illustrate that it's just tremendously diverse. So that's one item. Number two, I think anything that we find that's useful, especially in this early age of finally having chemical analytic tools to do an inventory of the chemoscape, is really a potential that must be improved upon in order to develop into a more mature therapeutic useful tool. And I think clinical researchers are the ground zero of illustrating the relevance of a particular chemovar in improving quality of life for a targeted group. And people like Dr. Adi Poe and Dr. Ethan Russo and Dr. David Marie and others are really at the front lines of being able to vindicate the utility. And inherently, because they're working on those things, not just in private companies, but also in public interest research, there is a a sort of opportunity where as the insight becomes made clear by virtue of, say, we've read Ethan Russo's newest paper and start to see, gosh, there's areas over here that we should be focusing more research on. We find that numerous producers around the world may have access to things that have similar inventory, and all collectively, like good science, get to work on those potentials, whether they're siloed and purely in their individual process, or they're collaborative and have networked scientific organizations, as we'd hope to see. That's really, I think, how insight continues to bubble. I think that in the cannabis space, especially with people who've been multi-generational and who really distrust corporations and distrust capitalism, rightfully so, there's a lot of sort of trauma that has to be digested in order to pursue the most useful expressions of this. Like if we withhold the one special thing and don't actually figure out ways by which to serve a lot of people with that to demonstrate its specialness, I don't know if we're, helping to protect the plant, or if we're actually keeping offline something that might really make a difference in the world's view of the plant. I feel actually the most important work is around storytelling right now. It's great that those of us who are able to work in a space of innovation and research are creating fruit that matters, but really the world still sees this as, a drug that's harmful, and it's coming out of a prohibition era branding exercise that lasted for decades, that continues to sort of create all kinds of stigma and sort of resistance between people having a correct relationship with this plant, which, there's no human or there's no mammal that shouldn't be interested in the potential of modulating the endocannabinoid system in meaningful ways to increase the quality of life. And yet we have a very limited sort of cross-section of the culture so far who's interested in that. Of course, you see with hemp and CBD, a broad and growing adopting sort of perspective that the chemistry in cannabis is really meaningful, but we just have so far to go. I really think that there's a kind of humility in recognizing how early stage we are to sort of more broadly experiment. But one other thing I'll say, the last part, is that I was really disappointed in Oregon when I was working with a variety of other groups that were very scientifically inspired and focused on cannabis to create this OHub campus that was initially, I think, going to be a site for state-funded research. There was actually a cannabis research panel that was authored, I believe, this was in, I don't know the exact year. This was at the beginning of regulation in Oregon, that essentially a variety of people were brought forward and told the state that this is what we think you should do. You should allocate, and Mowgli Holmes was really one of the people at the front of this, but other people, I know Ethan Russo was part of this, said you should really consider allocating like 1% of your tax revenue, reinvest that into public benefit research as a means of like substantiating this economy that everybody's speculating on being so important. But even that got shot down, never happened. There should be state sanctioned and supported research. There should be sort of public interest research that are what universities do. And that are, that's, if you go talk to academics in the space, like chemist in Israel named Lumir, he's just happy to share everything he can about what he's doing and why he's doing it. And he wants to meet others who are doing it so he can do it better. And that's great science. And it's just so unfortunate that instead of having any kind of public benefit research, other than few exceptions, we see this ecosystem of walled garden, sort of corporate, self-interest focused research for their own benefit and their own products and making claims that are dubious. And it's really frustrating because, of course, this is a plant that should be serving everybody, that is something that is certainly in public benefit, but we do not have in any of the early regulatory programs something akin to that. Instead, you continue to see University of Mississippi mailing sort of our friends, the last in the medical program, like a sort of series of joints that are 2% THC and moldy, and like you just don't see this sort of shared collective interest research happening. So I think that's a big loss. I think there's a lot of opportunities to actually find wins and to build gain in that direction as we go forward, and it should be on people's mind. But this shouldn't only be companies doing this on their own, but that's what companies have to do now. There isn't an alternative. So that means that everybody in my position or anybody who's working in a larger company has to balance how they're going to approach that. And I know that we found at Pruf an amazing ability to kind of really thread that in a way that inspires me and keeps me very interested in the future and what we can do for people, not just in our local region, but around the planet, with insight and advocacy and expertise that, we've also funded. And that's a really rare thing. I feel very lucky. I know others that are not so lucky. They're trying to continue to practice their craft within a company that's not going to support those same outcomes. And I know others who don't have the support of any company, who are working passionately on those outcomes, but are doing it in a marginalized scale. It's so small and it's so expensive and it's so challenging to produce meaningful results that actually make a difference, or meaningful plants at a tiny scale, when now there's been this era of mergers and acquisitions and market consolidation, and we're moving to stabilization, that suddenly you have to kind of find a team that can support it. But then can you find a team with ethics that shares this public benefit perspective to the extent that I have? God, it's so rare, Tad. It's, and that's the heartbreaking part of all this, is that we know we could do so much better. Imagine if there were 50 universities in the U.S. with each having a department like in Israel, sort of like a research grade academic supported department working together for the best interest for the whole. Immediately, in 1 year, we would have a very different relationship with this ancient plant.
Yeah. The idea around intellectual property that Nelson brings up is a really challenging one. And you're right. It's a whole podcast, and it's not something that can be easily answered.
I know. I will say I didn't do the best job either. There's so much I'm not saying I would like to say, but it literally is a podcast. And I hope that you get to do that. And I think Beth is a great start.
Yeah, but I want to just say the other thing you brought up that I think is really important is that we are really in the infancy with this plant and what we're learning about this plant. And the research that you're doing is really sort of at the frontier of where we're headed. And it's so wonderful. So thank you so much for all the work you do, for sharing this information with growers and listeners. And hope we can stay in touch and continue to learn from each other as we go.
Well, Tad, thank you for building an epic platform to have sophisticated conversations, not just sound bites, and for all the great people and content you've already brought forward. I'm honored to be here. I look forward to more in the future. I just really look forward to you continuing to help people to see some of the nuance and intricacy in this space so we can all respond more effectively to the challenge ahead. Thank you, my friend.
That was Jeremy Plumb, Director of Production Science at Pruf Cultivar. I've posted a ton of links and information relating to this podcast right on the podcast page at www.kisorganics.com. Just click on the podcast menu at the top of the home screen. Thanks for listening.